Hello, everybody. Welcome to week one, and I hope that everybody was able to kind of navigate what I know can really be a chaotic and crazy week one and start of, to a new semester. What I wanted to do for this video is just briefly go over kind of the history of psychology and where psychology came from and how it evolved into being the field that it is today. So let's go ahead and get started and talk about the history of psychology. Now, Wilhelm Wundt is kind of known as the father of psychology. And what he did is he used a scientific research method to study reaction times, specifically the differences in reaction times between kind of instinctual reflexive behaviors versus like conscious behavior. So, for example, one of the things that he did was he would take when you go to the doctor and they take that little hammer and they tap you on the knee with it, and then your leg kind of kicks up. So he would do that, and he would take a note of how long that happens in terms of that reaction between when he would tap the knee and when the leg would kick up, and that would happen almost instantaneously. And then he would ask his participants, the same people, and just say, "Hey, kick your leg up," right? And again, he would make a note of how long it took for them to replicate that behavior. And what he found was basically that if it was, if he was using the little hammer and it was a pure reflexive behavior, that happened almost instantaneously, like really, really fast. But if he asked the individual to kick their leg up, that would happen fairly quickly as well, but not as fast. There would be a little bit of a lag. And he thought that was really interesting. And we now know, it's a very common sense now that we understand that, yeah, well, one is a reflexive behavior that happens unconsciously, and the other one, there's some processing that needs to happen, right? And then we need to, not only do we need to process that information, but then we also need to come up with a response behavior. And so there's going to be a little bit of a lag. But for Wilhelm Wundt, this was fascinating. And he thought, you know what, somebody should study this. Somebody should study that whatever it is that's going on when we're consciously doing a behavior. And so, because nobody was studying this at the time, he proposed psychology, and he came up with psychology, and he wrote the first book called Principles of Physiological Psychology, or something like that. And he really, in that book, laid out what he thought psychology should be. And he thought that psychology should study consciousness, and that psychology should use the scientific method to research mental processes. Now, it wasn't until one of his students, Edward Titchener, who kind of came up with the first real school of thought in psychology, and that was what he dubbed structuralism. Your thoughts and your consciousness, as complex as that might be, if we studied it long enough, we could probably break that down to very basic uh, experiences of sensation and perception. And so to do this, Wundt and Titchener kind of came up with this process of introspection. Now, introspection roughly translates into thinking about thinking. It's I don't know if you've ever done this on your own, but like when you think about your own thoughts, like you'll have a thought and then you say, well, why did I think that? Or why do I have that thought? Where did this thought come from? And why am I feeling this all of a sudden? And what's wrong with me, right? Like just thinking about thinking. That's roughly what introspection is. Now, the long definition of introspection is basically that you're looking inwards to try to get and to kind of examine and get an understanding of your own thoughts and your own emotions. And so they proposed introspection, and they thought that by asking individuals about their thoughts and their emotions and their feelings and their conscious experiences, if they asked them long enough, they would eventually get to a point where they could figure out where the thought came from or where consciousness came from. So they were really trying to figure out the structure of consciousness, the structure of thoughts, and that's why this whole school of thought was dubbed structuralism. Now, there was a problem to their approach because they would bring people into their lab and they would just start asking them about their thoughts and why do you think this and why do you feel that and all of that. And people didn't think that was very scientific. And one of the reasons is, and the problem with this approach is that none of us think alike. We all think differently. People don't have the same thinking styles, dispositions, or processes. So if I get 100 people and I ask them the same question, I might get 100 completely different answers. So this process was doomed to fail from the start. It was very unreliable. It was definitely limiting, but it was also very subjective because everyone was going to have their their own answers to these questions. And so introspection and structuralism really failed, and it went away. Basically, when Edward Titchener died, structuralism kind of died along with him. Now, however, over in the United States, psychology became very, very popular due to somebody named William James. And William James said, you know what, forget structuralism, forget the structure of all of this stuff. We don't even understand the function, right? So he developed something called functionalism. And functionalism was the idea behind it was, um, how does consciousness function, and how does our brain function, and how does thinking function, and how does behavior function to help individuals uh, kind of survive and adapt to their environment. Now, he was highly influenced by Charles Darwin's theory of evolution through natural selection. And if you're familiar with that theory, it kind of says that organisms that can adapt to their environment are going to be the most successful in terms of survival and then reproduction, and basically pushing their genetic material into the future. And so that was very influential on William James's theory in functionalism. And so functionalism was all about, well, so how does behavior help us survive and adapt? How do our emotions help us survive and adapt? How do our thoughts help us survive and adapt? And that's really what functionalism was all about. And it was fairly successful up until it's just bad timing. Up until over in Europe, you had a guy by the name of Sigmund Freud really rise uh, to fame in terms of psychology, and this was really, I mean, maybe the first real celebrity in terms of psychology, and very popular. Sigmund Freud is so popular that a lot of times people think that he's actually the founder of psychology. And oftentimes, when people think about psychology, Freud is one of the first people they think of. And you've probably heard of Freud. Um, at some point, there's certain things that we have culturally that come from Freud, like things like a Freudian slip. That's something that's attributed to Freud as well. And so his theory was so both structuralism and functionalism very much looked at consciousness. But Freud really came up with the first time, and this was controversial at the time, and said, no, we should be focusing on the unconscious as well. And so psychoanalytic theory and Freud's theory was all about unconscious factors in behavior. And so he came up with a theory on personality and development, and he really emphasized early childhood experiences. But what he brought to the table was that we should be looking at these unconscious factors and behaviors, not just the conscious, but the unconscious. Specifically, that Freud believed that unconscious biological forces were kind of driving our behavior. This was a very deterministic theory, meaning that Freud did not believe that we're in control of our own behaviors. Freud thought that there were unconscious biological forces that were kind of driving all of our behaviors. And now we know, to an extent, we know there are biological needs that we have to survive. So we need to eat, we need to drink, we need to sleep, we need shelter, we're a social being as well, so we need to socialize, we need to reproduce, all those things. These are all things that we need, not just for ourselves to survive, but for our species to survive as well. But Freud said, um, trying to meet these basic biological needs, that there were forces within us, unconscious forces that were driving us to meet these needs, that were really in control of our behavior, and that we weren't actually in control. That we just have this illusion, because we're conscious beings and we're aware of what's going on around us, that we have this illusion that we're in control of our behavior, when it's really these unconscious biological forces that are driving that. And to no surprise, there's a lot of people who didn't like this, especially here in the United States. So that kind of gave rise to behaviorism. Now, behaviorism had its foundations in Russia by a guy named Ivan Pavlov. And John Watson kind of wrote the first book on behaviorism, or the first paper on it, and then B.F. Skinner just kind of took it to the next level. And we'll talk about all of these guys and all of these theories more as we move on through the semester, so don't worry about it. Right now, it's just a very brief introduction. And so these guys didn't like this notion of the unconscious and this biological drivers and all of that, because they wanted to kind of go back to the roots of psychology being more scientific. And they thought that, hey, if psychology was ever going to be taken seriously as a science, we need to start doing things like scientists do, which is do research and experiments. And we can't research things like consciousness and the unconscious. There's no way to do that. And we can't really research these unconscious biological drives that supposedly drive our behavior. So all we can really study is observable behavior, and that's what psychology should look at. It's just behavior that we can actually observe. And so they also came up with this notion that all of our behaviors are learned. And not only are they learned, but they're learned through our interaction with the environment. And they really put out this belief that the environment is what shapes our behavior. It's not these unconscious biological factors that are driving our behavior. No, no, no. Your behavior is being shaped by the environment. Now, this is also very deterministic. Theory, especially if you go on and look at kind of how B.F. Skinner's beliefs and the things that he kind of published, where he also kind of thought that there was no such thing as free will, that we're not really in control of our behavior, and instead our behavior is a direct result from uh, our conditioning through our our interactions with the environment. So they really, a lot of behaviors, especially a lot of extreme behaviors, also kind of felt similar to Freud, where it was just a different reasoning for it. So where Freud said all our behavior is determined by these biological unconscious forces, the behaviors said, no, no, our behavior is a result of our environment, that our environment shapes our behavior and we're not really in control. We're just reacting to whatever's going on in the environment, right? So you have the first two major kind of schools and movements in psychology both kind of tell us that, you know what, you're not actually in control of your behavior. So a lot of people didn't like that. And so that gave rise to kind of the third force in psychology, which we now call humanism. And Carl Rogers played a really big role. And then Abraham Maslow did some extra work as well, to really make humanism very, very popular. And there were a bunch of people that are kind of credited for humanism, but Carl Rogers is usually like the first person we kind of think of. And humanists believe that they were like, no, 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 no. We're against this prior deterministic, these prior deterministic views of psychoanalysis and behaviorism. It's not Biology's not in control of your behavior, and the environment's not in control of your behavior. You're in control of your behavior, and that we make conscious decisions that lead to our behavior. And that was kind of the main thing that humanism brought to the table. Now, they didn't ignore the other two. So they didn't ignore biology. They still thought that biology played an important role, and they still thought the environment played an important role. However, they didn't think that, they thought that these things have influence, but they're not in control of the behavior. And so instead they said, we make conscious decisions based on our immediate biological needs and based on our immediate circumstances. So they took biology and the environment uh, and said that those are factors in our behavior when we make decisions about what we're going to do next. So those are kind of the three major movements historically in psychology. So you have psychoanalysis, which said unconscious biological drives determine our behavior. And you had behaviorism, which said the environment determines our behavior. Then you had the humanists who kind of said, no, it's our conscious decisions that determine the behavior. But something was missing, right? Like if you go back and you think about what Wilhelm Wundt said about what psychology should be, right? Psychology should be the study of consciousness, and we should use a scientific method to research mental processes. And if you go to the definition of psychology, is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. But if you look at these three major movements, the one thing they all have in common is that they're trying to explain where behaviors come from. However, they're leaving out the mental processes aspect. And that's where the cognitive revolution comes into play. So this happened around in the 60s. And Ulrich Neisser, he's kind of the first person to write a book on cognitive psychology, and Noam Chomsky, a major player in terms of his research on language and the mind and thinking and all of that, really made this a very popular movement. And the whole movement was basically focused on that we need to reincorporate the mental aspect, the mental function, the mental processes into psychology so that we can get a full picture and a full understanding of behavior. That if you really want to understand human behavior, you cannot leave out the thinking part. You cannot leave out thoughts. You cannot leave out memories. You cannot leave out language. You cannot leave out decision making and planning. That all of that stuff needs to also be looked at so that we really get a full understanding of human behavior and get the big picture. Uh, and that's kind of where we left it. And there haven't really been any major movements since. Some people argue that maybe positive psychology is kind of the next major movement in psychology, but we haven't really had any major breakthroughs other than like biologically and with technology and our understanding of the brain and stuff like that. Um, there haven't been major breakthroughs in terms of theories. So nowadays, it's no longer so theory driven in terms of where, like in the past, throughout the history of psychology, it was very contentious. So you had the psychoanalysts, and then the behaviorists came out because they wanted to disprove psychoanalysis, and then the humanists came out and said, "No, you both are wrong," and you're right. So it's very, very contentious. Nowadays, most people who become psychologists have a very eclectic style. So they generally have one area of specialties that they focus on and that they work on, but they draw from a bunch of different perspectives and a bunch of different theories. And we kind of view all of these theories that were very, very influential and are still with us today. So we still have a psychodynamic perspective. We still have a behavioral perspective. We have a humanistic perspective. These things are still around with us, but we treat them more as kind of roadmaps than definitives. So if you think about like when you pull up an address on your phone and you're trying to get there, right, on a navigation system, uh, there's more than just one route that you can take to get from point A to point B, right? So like it'll pull up the fastest route, it'll pull up the shortest route, it might pull up the most scenic route. It'll pull up a route that's all just freeway, right? And then they'll pull up a route that's all just, main streets, right? So there's a bunch of different ways that you can go to get to wherever it is that you're going. And that's kind of how we look at these theories nowadays and these perspectives, that they're all going to get you there, but the process of getting there and how we get there are completely different because they all explain things from completely different perspectives. And some of these theories are better than others at explaining certain things, and all of these theories have their shortcomings as well. But that's kind of where we're at, and that's, again, like I said, I wanted to keep this really brief and just make a very brief video about the history of psychology. And like I said, we will cover all of this in a lot more detail throughout the rest of the semester. So thank you guys for watching, and if you have any questions at all, if you're reading through this material or you'd like to know a little bit more, just shoot me an email and I'll get back to you. All right, take care.